to the discussion of Black European history. My name is Christine Gerberding, and I'm editor-director in the cultural department of Norddeutscher Broadcasting, NDR. And I'm very pleased to start the session with a spotlight on the untold stories of Black Europeans with Professor Olivette Otele. After those probably very short 30 minutes, we'll be joined by Fatima El-Tayeb from the University of California and Mamoudou Malcolm Jallow, member of the Swedish Reichstag and General Rapporteur for Combating Racism and Intolerance at the Council of Europe. Professor Otele, a warm welcome to you, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. Please allow me a few words about your research and professional career to our audience. Professor Otele is Professor for History and Memory of Enslavement at the University of Bristol. In this position, she's UK's first Black female professor of history, if I may add. Her areas of research are colonial and post-colonial history and histories of people of African descent. Her latest book is about the untold story of African Europeans, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about. Professor Otele, you once said history is about sharing stories. So with regards to the African Europeans, there are a lot of untold stories, which is the subtitle of your book. How come that those stories have not been told before?
Well, first of all, thank you ever so much for having me here today. I'm absolutely delighted to be sharing the talk with distinguished guests as well later on, and with yourself. Actually, the idea that there are stories that are untold is another provocation I wanted to engage with, because these stories have been known by many communities, and in particular people of African descent. It's just that they haven't been shared and woven on together from across Europe. For example, the stories of Alexander de Medici are very well known in Italy, for example, but not necessarily in France, and vice versa for the story of the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. So I just wanted to bring them all together and see and play with the idea of erasure and the idea of memorialization and remembering, remembering, and all the rest of it. So it was just a provocation, I suppose.
Well, the aim of the book is not only to tell merely individual stories, also you just pointed a couple of names out, and I must confess that I got to know a lot of impressive people I did not know before, so you absolutely made the point. But with your book, you want to reveal some significant part of the Black populations in Europe played as a whole, and not only to tell individual stories. So why is that so important?
It is important to me because individualizing certain stories means that there weren't that many of them at the time. Whereas if we look at the strands, if we look at the longer history, we see that there's a tradition of Black radicalism, a tradition of resilience across time and place, and that started long before the colonial times. And I really wanted people to understand that it's about collaborations, it's about exchanges, it's about brutal encounters as well. So it's much more complex than that story of colonial era that we've been taught at school.
That's true, because normally you probably start with the colonialism. So maybe considering the long history of the African Europeans, what are the main development directions? I know you cannot put your whole book into a few sentences, but maybe you can draw a short line from the beginning up to the turning point, actually.
Okay, so it was kind of fun for me to think about 20 centuries of Black history, as I saw it, or the history of people of African descent. So what I wanted to do is go back to Roman times. Again, another provocation, because Rome is seen as the birth of civilization by many, as the place of intellectual development and so on and so forth. And I just wanted to challenge that and look at the idea that Rome was broader in terms of racialization, in terms of ethnicity than it has been taught previously. We know about, of course, Roman soldiers, but I wanted to look at that period and to show that Rome was also about Africa and African conquest. And then I move across time and place because I just wanted to see how these stories have traveled across time. So we ended up 13th century Magdeburg, Granada, and then we tackle the idea of otherness, which is about not just the skin tones, but actually goes back to the othering through religion and religious practices, Muslim versus Christian, but also the idea of othering through geography, with Irish people being seen as a different race by the English. So all these things, I wanted to draw all these things together to see that the colonial times in terms of 16th century, 17th century created another kind of racialization that trumped all the others at some point in time. And this is mainly what we remember today, when actually it was much more diverse and complex than that.
Yeah, I guess we'll talk about the aspect of the othering later on. So what you defined are certain patterns of traditional narratives dealing with Black African history, such as infantilization, which is the sort of source of paternalization of the white Europeans, or exotism, which explains a sort of fascination of difference, and also a sort of bestialization. So these kind of patterns, what were they used for, and what kind of attitude do they reveal in telling the story?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say that these categorizations are varied, and scholar Gianke Ondius used them, but many others have used them before that. And it really is about a response to European economic supremacy. While Europe was getting wealthy and kind of cementing its economic supremacy, there was also fear, anxiety towards what they saw as the other. So there were various perceptions and various ways to kind of fight against the narrative of fear, and to address that narrative by the ways in which communities in Europe were looking at people of African descent. So infantilization, for example, is this idea that Africans or people of African descent were like, as actually abolitionist William Wilberforce said, they were children of nature who were not prepared for freedom, and therefore they needed to be taken and needed to be prepared very delicately and could not be set free. In other words, they were enslaved and they could redeem themselves through Christianization, but it was out of question to actually set them free. So you have all these questions of infantilization. Bestialization is another category. I could go on and on. I don't know if we'll have time for this, but it was really a response to certain representation of the so-called other, and that correspond to the fear of so-called invasion already in the 18th century Europe.
So has there ever been a time where this othering has been on equal level? Because all the other narratives you mentioned, or the patterns we have been talking about, have been patterns of hierarchy and of white supremacy in a way. So has there been a time where it has been equal, and this construct of othering has been on the same level?
Well, I'm contending that actually before colonial slave trade, there were a pattern of, there were kind of ideas of equality or equity all before that. That's why I wanted to go back to Rome and to that period prior to European colonization, because with colonization, a new pattern was born, and as I said, based on economic supremacy. So, and as time went by, and as we go across time and place, and we reach, I'm just jumping centuries now, we reach decolonization and all the rest of it, we have already inherited those patterns of infantilization, those ideas of othering. based on skin tones and so-called diminished intellects and so on and so forth. In other words, scientific racism, so-called scientific racism. So this is the era we're living in, is just a result of just, let's say, 3 centuries of narratives that have been built.
Before we speak about nowadays, I'd like to come to one point which is the crucial point, actually, which is the point where the slave trade starts, where you have the construct of racial inferiority, and you describe in your book that at that point a transformation started. Was it only for economical reasons?
Well, for me, what is interesting to look at is that the first kind of travelers, the early travelers, if you would, who encounters African cultures, let's say 11th century, 12th century, even 13th century, and I'm talking sub-Saharan Africans. The example we have are people who are actually talking about powerful culture, powerful empires, with a sophisticated system of agricultural systems and so on and so forth. And then 2 centuries later, the discourse has completely changed. And therefore, there has been an erasure of what early European travelers found on the ground. So for me, it's interesting to kind of look at that and to look at how we construct and to fit into a model that is based on economic supremacy has actually trumped everything else that historically has been kind of documented.
Mm-hmm. So the long history of African-European identities is not only very little known, but it also does not correspond to our preconceptions of today. So how come that these preconceptions are so long-lasting? And what does it say about today's societies?
For me, it's another fascinating a kind of question, simply because, as I said, we inherited 2 centuries or 3 centuries of colonization and a narrative constructed over 2 or 3 centuries. And we don't necessarily, at least in the public eye, we haven't been challenging it in a way that question what we see as so-called canons. In the last few, the decolonial movement have been doing that, but I'm talking about a broader majority community actually addressing these questions. So what we see today, and nowadays, and that's probably why we're having this conversation, is that there are many multi-layers and multiple ways to tell the stories, colonial stories and the history of people of African descent and European descent. And there are other ways to explain how this narrative was constructed. It was a comfortable narrative that is plays on the idea of social cohesion, people sharing the same narrative of conquest, of victory, bring communities together. So this idea of social cohesion is incredibly important. This idea of shared identity, shared history, but the majority group is actually what cemented all these narratives, and that's why we're being taught in schools.
So did I get you right, that you think this is not only a scientific discourse at this moment, that there is a movement towards plurality and multi-perspective approach? Or is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. There have been a pushback for quite some time. And that is why I talked earlier about a long history of Black activism, radical activism, because it's a story that exists, that has been in place for centuries. But in the last few, let's say the last 50 years, we have seen an increase of debates about this, and we have seen production, scholarly production about this long history. And I very welcome that kind of production, because it has fostered a vibrant public debate about opening up, decolonizing the curriculum, and so on and so forth.
Speaking about decolonization, which is a term that sort of leads or moves into any kind of areas within society and the scientific community and so forth, how can exploring the untold history and the new narratives, which are multi-perspective, how can those untold stories shed a light in a way on today's important challenges? Because,
Well,
sorry.
yes, sorry.
Yeah, no, that was one question. So maybe we could stick to that one first before I ask.
Okay, how the colonial movement is interesting because it's defined differently by many people. But the whole idea is that it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. It makes a lot of people question what is it that we haven't decolonized already, and therefore we're forced to look at the ways in which we teach our children the kind of stories that are presented to us, and the way the tools that are used to teach as well. So it's not just about the canons, questioning the canons, deconstructing the material. It's also about who gets to teach what. And who gets to teach what is incredibly important as well, because it means that there's not a monopoly of people of European descent telling the story and producing and distributing knowledge.
So if I may ask this quite personal question, do you already experience a difference about what your children are taught and what you have been taught?
Oh, definitely. There's a huge difference. And what I see as the younger generation are very much in touch with this idea of cultural diversity, and they don't put up with what I put up when I was growing up in Paris. They question, they challenge the teacher, and I see it in my classroom, and I see it with my children. So, as a teacher, it's not comfortable, but it shouldn't be.
I think when we speak about people of African descent in Europe, although you draw a positive perspective at this point, we still have to speak about ongoing racism and traditional patterns out of the colonial times. You once said, no, actually you said in October last year in an interview with The Guardian that the racial discourse, I quote, that looks as if it is dynamic and shifting, but it is in fact terminally repetitive. That's the end of the quote. So what does that mean, and why do we have the same discussions then? From my understanding, it's because we have them because everything seems to be repeated and it's not the end of the discussion yet, but you obviously experience something different.
Well, there's two sides. There are two sides to this question, because we do indeed move forward in so many ways, in so many areas, but there's also resistance to that. There's a pushback, as we know, against this, what some people call a rewriting of history and the revision of history that is detrimental to our national narrative. I would just say, as a historian, we constantly rewrite history. So what are they on about? So the second point is that the pushback is a sign of discomfort. And I welcome the discomfort, because it's about time people who have been kind of placed on top of the social ladder are challenged about their privileges and are challenged about the ways in which they consider, they represent, and the space they give to minority groups in the global north. So yes, discomfort, but discomfort means we are perhaps building a collective, a memory that hopefully at some point will become collective.
So if you say that this kind of racial discourse needs to stop, what else do you think should be discussed then?
Well, what should be discussed is actually the tools. What is it that we do on a daily basis to change people's lives? We can talk for ages. What is it that we do practically to raise the bar and give people access, for example, to economic means, to better education, to kind of better health as well, because discrimination in the health system and so on and so forth. So I want to see the practical measures that each government, each country is actually taking, rather than keeping the debate at an intellectual level, which is important, but it's not enough.
You also said that it's necessary to create story of resistance and story of collaborations that are not necessarily referring to the white community. So is your book one of those stories, or one of those multiple stories? Or
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And apologetically, for me, it's important. As I said, who gets to tell the story matters. And this book is, African Europeans, it means about bringing about communities together, but also telling people of African descent that, we are in 2021. And if we still exist in the global northeast, it is because we have been resilient. It is because we have been survivors. And we need to teach our children and other children from all communities that there is such a thing as organized activism, and there are ways to do that. There are practical ways to be a kind of social, economic, and justice warrior. There are ways. It's not just speech. We need to organize, to be organized.
So, so if I may sort of round up, is that since there are these kind of activities, you, in a way, have a quite positive future ahead, hopefully. But on the other hand, this also means that there is still exclusion of Black and people of color in the society and also in the European narrative. So what is necessary to include them?
Okay, so there are many, we're talking practical. I just wanted to say that if, you know, there seems to be a positive outlook on things and the future seems to be brighter and all the rest of it, minority ethnic groups are still at the bottom of social ladder. They're still part of the working class in every European country that you consider. So when we talk, for example, in Britain, about the white working class, well, the Black working class, the Black community has been working class as a whole for such a long time, and it's still the majority of them. So prevention, discrimination actually leads to a lack of access to wealth, and that has detrimental impact. So what needs to happen is finding pipelines to actually open up these resources to everybody who deserve to be, who deserve to have them. And who's those deserving people? Well, everybody. So it's about class, gender, it's about race, religion, and so on and so forth. So creating those pipelines is about mentoring. It's about, at the end of mentoring, providing actually jobs for those people who have been mentored. It's about access to health. And as we have seen with COVID-19, you know, disparities and racial disparities have been stark in minority ethnic communities in comparison to other communities. So there are things, so many things to be done, and we really need to get to work.
Thank you. Actually, there is only little time left before we open up, and we have asked for questions. You are kindly enough to answer, and I have two questions which slightly connect to our conversation now. One is about the complex, about the othering and the times before colonization. And the question is from Johannes Ahlefeld: to which extent did intra-regional connections or integration exist in African societies before colonization?
Well, these were powerful kingdoms, so every kingdom were defending its own territories. So integration was really, it's just like in European kingdoms. Everybody, the other was the person who was outside the kingdom. The other was the person. The other was subjected to cruelty as well. The other was susceptible to be taken away and enslaved. And it wasn't based on the skin tone. It was based on the fact that they did not belong to the community. And I'm answering this question. It's a very important one because I've heard all my life the fact that, well, Africans also saw their own people. No, they were their own people. If you were outside that kingdom, you were not the person who belongs to that kingdom, and therefore you were not valuable enough to be kept.
This is true, but I think the question was also about African societies in that
Today?
time. Mm-hmm. No, in that time, actually. Not only the connection between African societies and the European societies, but also within Africa, the African societies before the white went into Africa.
Okay, but these societies merged over time. Some were conquered by others. In other words, they were merged, there were conflicts, there were collaborations, just like European history. So it's an interesting, it actually deserves a whole new discussion because it's an interesting trajectory that also I believe needs to be taught.
Okay, then we make a huge time step again and come to our times, and something quite important in Germany just happened, that the German and Namibian government just concluded negotiations addressing the colonial past. It has been, I think, signed 2 days ago. And Johannes Ahlefeld again asked, what do you think of starting the process by an address of the German President Steinmeier in Namibian parliament, recognizing the crushing of the Herero uprising as a genocide? And what else would it take to heal the wounds of the colonial past, possibly not only by Namibia?
Okay, so if we're talking about acknowledgement, then we're talking about addressing the past and repairing. How do we do to repair in various ways? Repairing means reparations. Reparations can take various forms, and we need to start having this conversation. It's an uncomfortable one again, but acknowledging, apologizing is a first step, but it's never enough. It will never be enough.
And besides the economical side, is this symbolic way of acknowledgement important?
Repairing is not just economic. Repairing, it's acknowledging, it's about looking at a curriculum, it's about teaching that history, it's about actually engaging with various stories of people on the ground. It's also about sharing sharing the culture that has been destroyed because of the genocide. It takes so many forms that go way, way beyond the economic aspect of it. That's why we talk about reparative justice than simply reparations.
I always wonder myself whether repair is the right word, because repairing, I actually feel helpless, because repairing obviously is something where you sort of have the danger to put an end to a discussion or anything like that. So keeping a sort of scarf, in a way, keeps the memories and the narratives at our knowledge, as far as I'm concerned.
It's a very valid point.
So there are no more questions. So actually, if possible, thank you very much. I'd like to open our spotlight now to the panel.